The corridors of Capitol Hill were unnaturally quiet that evening, the kind of silence that doesn't arrive gently. It creeps in heavy, like a warning. Jasmine Crockett sat alone in her office, the last light flickering through the Venetian blinds. Her suit jacket hung over the back of her chair, sleeves rolled, phone silenced. The day had bled into night, but something kept her rooted there, a gnawing feeling. And then, just after 8:42 p.m., a rustling at the door. No knock, just a sound. She rose, approached, and cracked the door open. Nothing. But on the floor was a thick yellow envelope. No address, no stamp, no sender. She picked it up slowly, weighed it in her hands. It felt heavy with something real. Back at her desk, she peeled it open, expecting another brief on housing or veterans' affairs. What slid out made her stomach turn. Photographs, some black and white, others grainy and dim, of spoiled food trays, children in oversized ICE-issued sweatshirts, bent-over toilets, vomiting. There were incident logs, internal memos from DHS nutrition supervisors, audit sheets with whole columns blacked out, and stapled at the back. A food service contract, $257 million awarded to Patriot Foods, LLC, signed under Trump's administration without competitive bidding. Jasmine's eyes narrowed. She flipped through rapidly. A second contract. A third. All directed to the same company. Emergency authorizations. Expedited. Security risk reduction. National interest. The language wasn't unfamiliar, but the frequency was alarming. One name appeared repeatedly in the margins. Robert D. Haskins. She tapped her laptop. A brief search turned up his LinkedIn, founder of Patriot Foods, former steakhouse CEO, political donor. But it wasn't just any donation. Jasmine scrolled to an archived FEC record. Robert D. Haskins, $900,000 to the Trump Victory Fund. A cold realization akin. This wasn't about bad food, it was about access, money flowing up while the sickened children, some as young as 4, were treated like afterthoughts. She stood, papers in hand, and paced the room. This wasn't something to leak to the press. This needed sunlight, cameras, subpoenas. She called Representative Lara Menendez from the Oversight Committee. No pleasantries. "I need an emergency evidentiary session," Jasmine said, her voice like flint. "ICE, food contracts, Trump donors, sick kids. I have documents." There was a pause. Then, "Bring everything. Tomorrow, we'll schedule a closed review." Jasmine hung up, leaned against the window, and stared at the city. Below, Washington moved on. Limousines glided past. Laughter floated up from some rooftop cocktail hour. But in her hand was a folder of evidence, not just of neglect, but of cruelty repackaged as policy. She slid the documents into a locked briefcase, closed it with a click, and whispered under her breath, "This won't stay buried." The next morning, the wheels began to turn. Quiet emails, subpoena drafts, a hearing date placed discreetly on the calendar, and in the middle of it all, Jasmine, focused, furious, and waiting. Because the scandal hadn't erupted yet, but the fuse had been lit. The hearing room was colder than usual, chilled by the hum of overworked air vents and the tension thickening with every passing minute. Congressional aides moved briskly between desks, whispering updates, while members of the Oversight Committee thumbed through thick binders marked confidential. Jasmine Crockett sat poised, the folder resting at the edge of her desk like a detonator. Cameras blinked red. The public feed was live. This wasn't a backroom briefing anymore. The chair banged the gavel once. "We are here today to investigate irregularities in federal food procurement during the Trump administration, specifically contracts awarded to private vendors supplying ICE detention facilities." Jasmine didn't wait to be invited. She rose slowly, her voice measured but resolute. "I want to begin not with statistics, but with a child." She held up a photograph. The screen behind her flickered to life. A 7-year-old girl named Luz Maria, small-framed, sitting cross-legged on a concrete floor wrapped in an aluminum blanket. In front of her, a styrofoam tray with a grayish stew. Her face was blank, her eyes too tired for her age. She was detained at an ICE facility in McAllen, Texas. For 9 weeks, she was fed a rotating menu of expired rice, peanut butter packets labeled, "Not for individual sale," and mystery meat sandwiches so cold the centers were still frozen. Murmurs rippled through the room. Jasmine continued, her hand trembling just slightly. She wrote a letter to her mother. We translated it. I want to read just one line. She opened a folded page and steadied her voice. Please tell them the food makes us sick, and the guards don't care. Silence. She stepped aside as another image filled the screen. Inspection reports from July 2020 showing 2 ICE centers with over 40 violations, including storing milk unrefrigerated for over 17 hours and using canned goods 18 months past expiration. These weren't isolated lapses, Jasmine said. They were patterns hidden from public view. She motioned for an aide who passed around a redacted DHS report previously buried under a pending legal review label. This was written by an internal IC nutrition auditor. It details 5 outbreaks of foodborne illness across 3 detention centers, including one affecting 28 children under age 12. A congressman from the other side of the aisle leaned forward. Do you have any evidence these illnesses were directly caused by the food, Representative Crockett? She turned, ready. Autopsies? No. ICE didn't authorize medical autopsies on minors. But here's what we do have. Hospital admittance records, sworn affidavits from nurses, and this. He raised a photo slowly. A child, pale and thin, with IV tubes running from both arms, his mouth flecked with ulcers. Next to him, on the tray, a sandwich with green fuzz across the edges of the bread. This boy was 6. The facility's vendor was Patriot Foods. The delivery that week? Uninspected. The room went still. She placed the photo down. I'm not interested in performative outrage, but I am interested in accountability. These children were not just forgotten. They were discarded by a system that decided contracts mattered more than care. Across the aisle, Trump's legal team whispered furiously. One advisor typed frantic notes into an iPad, but Trump himself, sitting stiffly behind the committee witness desk, didn't flinch. He just stared at the table. Jasmine walked back to her seat, every step slow and deliberate. This wasn't about policy anymore. It was about memory. And the children the system had erased, and she was going to make sure the country remembered. The next slide Jasmine cued on the projector wasn't a photo of suffering children or spoiled food. It was a corporate logo, bold serif lettering over a waving flag, underscored by a simple tagline. Patriot Foods, LLC, feeding freedom. The irony practically dripped from the screen. She stepped forward. Let's talk about the vendor. Silence met her words as she held up a document stack clipped with red tape. Patriot Foods received over $257 million in federal contracts between 2018 and 2020. Not one of them went through competitive bidding. She paused, letting the weight of it settle. They were authorized under emergency procurement exemptions, justified by national security. But there was no natural disaster, no war, no sudden supply collapse, just a political administration willing to reward loyalty with taxpayer cash. She clicked the remote again. The screen shifted to a photo of Robert S. T.D. Haskins, tan-skinned, aviator sunglasses on, grinning with a golf club in one hand, and Donald Trump standing beside him, giving a thumbs up at Mar-a-Lago. Haskins, the founder of Patriot Foods, is a steakhouse entrepreneur. No prior record of federal food service, no certifications, but this, she tapped the image, this is what opened the door. She pulled out a campaign finance record and let it speak. Haskins donated $900,000 to the Trump Victory Fund, and 3 weeks later, Patriot Foods was awarded its first federal contract, expedited, sealed, and shielded from standard USDA compliance. A murmur swept the room. She turned to the committee. Now I know what you're thinking. Correlation isn't causation. Maybe he was just the only one who applied. Maybe Patriot Foods was patriotic enough. She tapped the folder. So let's hear from the man himself. A large monitor lit up with a deposition clip from a sealed court record. Robert Haskins sat in a deposition room, face flushed, fingers steepled nervously. A lawyer off camera asked, "Had Patriot Foods served any detention or government facilities before 2018? Haskins stammered, "No, sir." "Had you passed USDA federal food safety protocols?" We figured we'd meet those as we scaled." "Did you provide any references or prior safety records?" A pause. Then, "No, but we had good intentions." The clip ended. Jasmine looked up, voice steady. "They figured it out as they went. Children were the test subjects." She approached Trump directly now. Slow steps, gaze fixed. "Mr. Trump, is it standard protocol in your administration to hand hundreds of millions in contracts to unqualified donors?" He didn't answer. His attorney leaned in and whispered. Trump shifted, eyelids heavy with calculation. Jasmine stopped just short of the boundary line. "I'll tell you what it sounds like to me. Grift, dressed up in patriotism. And the price was paid not in dollars, but in stomachs." She returned to the panel table and lifted the final page. This wasn't an oversight. It was a blueprint of favoritis, and decay. She placed the document flat for the press to see, a signed directive from Trump's budget office authorizing streamlined procurement flexibility, marked urgent and co-signed by 2 cabinet-level officials now under private investigation. The room didn't erupt. It didn't need to. The silence meant they understood. This was systemic. Not one bad apple, but a tree rotting from its roots. She didn't blink as the next witness appeared on the screen. Dr. Laura Serrano's face came into focus. Poised, hollow-eyed, her jaw set with quiet fury. She had worked for ICE nutrition compliance under the Office of Detention Oversight, and what she was about to say would break the room. "Dr. Serrano, describe what you witnessed during your inspection of the El Paso detention facility in May of 2020. Jasmine said, her voice even. Dr. Serrano inhaled sharply. "When I walked into the kitchen area, the smell hit me first. It was..." She paused, searching for the right word. "Rot. Meat that had turned. Cheese gone soft with mold. I opened one of the freezers. There were rodents nesting behind the shelves." Some of the committee members visibly recoiled. Serrano continued. "The storage logs had been doctored. I found chicken labeled with future expiration dates despite being visibly gray. The pantry was infested with beetles. The bread had larvae in it." Jasmine leaned forward. "Did you report this?" "Immediately," Serrano nodded. "I filed a violation report with the DHS Health Oversight Division, and I contacted my supervisor, but a week later, I received a reassignment notice. They pulled me off all ICE-related inspections." The monitor flashed images Dr. Serrano had submitted under whistleblower protections, meat soaked in blood pooling at the bottom of packaging, milk cartons 2 weeks expired, a cooler held shut with duct tape. Jasmine's voice rose, slicing through the room. "And the vendor responsible for supplying that facility? Patriot Foods. And did anyone from the Trump administration acknowledge your report?" "No," Serrano replied, jaw clenched. "My emails were bounced. One was flagged as disruptive to ongoing partnerships. I was instructed to cease internal communication about food conditions." Jasmine stepped back, flipping to a section of a redacted memo. "This document," she said, raising it high, "was written by a senior official at DHS. It recommends, and I quote, preserving vendor relationships to protect administrative optics." She slammed it down. Administrative optics, while children were eating contaminated food and vomiting into trash bags. From the gallery, a mother in the front row broke into tears. Jasmine caught her eye for just a second, then turned to Trump, who remained rigid and silent. "Do you deny that your administration received these reports?" she asked. He shifted in his chair. His lawyer placed a hand on his shoulder, whispering. But Jasmine didn't wait for a reply. She moved to the projector again, this time loading a video. A former guard, voice disguised and face blurred, recounted in shaky words how food delivery days were dubbed roulette days by the staff. Some days meals were half frozen. Other days, sour. A few had maggots. Jasmine muted the clip halfway through. That was enough. She turned back to the committee. This wasn't a one-off. It wasn't a missed shipment or a pandemic oversight. This was a sustained, willful disregard for safety, committed under the illusion of efficiency and drenched in political favoritism. A long beat passed. Representative Caldwell from across the aisle finally leaned into his mic, clearly rattled. "And you're saying the administration knew?" Jasmine answered without pause. "I'm saying they knew, and they let it happen anyway." She gathered the printed inspection logs, stacked them neatly, and looked at the chair. "My next question," she said slowly, "is why the man who signed the contracts is under investigation yet." And as the chair silently nodded, the gavel came down. A recess was called. But the room didn't move. It just sat there, heavy with the weight of what had just been shown, no longer about ideology, not about border policy. This was rot, literal and moral. And it had a signature. When the hearing reconvened, the mood was different, tighter, sharper, as though the building itself sensed the shift. The cameras had returned, now live on multiple feeds. Twitter was ablaze. News anchors were cutting in mid-sentence. Something was happening. Jasmine Crockett stood once more, but this time she didn't address the committee. She turned and faced the man himself. Donald Trump sat at the witness table, flanked by counsel, arms folded across his chest like a fortress. He had been here for over an hour, stone-faced, letting his attorneys speak. But now, Jasmine wanted his voice. "Mr. Trump," she began, her tone precise, low and cutting, "you authorized an emergency provision allowing Patriot Foods to bypass FDA review, correct?" He blinked but said nothing. She took a step closer. "I'm holding in my hand a directive, signed by you, marked urgent, expedite contractor deployment to ICE sites." This was the justification for skipping inspections, wasn't it? Still no answer. The air thickened. Jasmine held up a photo. Grainy, printed in black and white. A toddler in an ICE facility, curled up on the floor, his mouth open mid-wail. In front of him, a lunch tray holding a sandwich with green mold at the edges and a pool of lukewarm gray stew. This child was served this meal during the second quarter of 2020. The contractor? Patriot Foods. The authorization? Yours. She placed the photo down gently, her hand trembling now, not with fear, but fury barely contained. "Mr. Trump," she said again, louder, firmer, "were you aware of these conditions when you roved continued funding to Patriot Foods?" For the first time, Trump moved. He opened his mouth, as if to speak, but stopped. His lips parted, then sealed again. His tongue flicked against his teeth. His gaze drifted. The room fell into absolute silence. Not a cough, not a shuffle, just breath held. C-SPAN's live counter in the corner ticked forward. 1 second, 2, 5, 8, still nothing. He leaned forward, opened his hands slightly, as if rehearsing something in his head, but no words came out. 11 seconds. 15. He glanced toward his attorney, who didn't speak. No lifeline came. 19 seconds. Then Jasmine spoke again, voice slicing through the stillness. "Your silence, Mr. Trump, says more than your defense ever could." He finally looked at her, face tight, but he still didn't speak. She turned to the committee and addressed the moment. This is the sound of responsibility meeting reality. For 19 seconds, the former president of the United States could not explain why his administration fed children moldy food while rewarding his friends with our tax dollars. A single gavel crack echoed, but it wasn't from the chair. It was symbolic, a judgment from the audience, the nation, history itself. Trump sat back. His knuckles were pale, his jaw clenched. In that moment, even without a word, he had already testified. Not in defense, not in denial, but in undeniable guilt. And as Jasmine returned to her seat, the entire room seemed to breathe again, as if a storm had passed through it, brief but unforgettable. One of the aides whispered to her as she sat down, They'll be playing that clip for the next 20 years. Jasmine didn't respond. She didn't need to. Because the clip didn't need editing. No music, no commentary. Just 19 seconds of a man's silence and a nation's reckoning. The room hadn't recovered from Trump's silence when Jasmine signaled for the next witness. A man in a gray suit with a crisp blue tie, and the permanent look of someone who had once believed his decisions would never be questioned, took the seat beneath the bright lights. "State your name and your former title," the chair instructed. "Thomas Acker, former Director of Federal Procurement Operations, Office of Management and Budget." Jasmine approached slowly, arms folded. "Mr. Acker, how many food contracts did you personally oversee between 2018 and 2020 for detention facilities?" He adjusted his tie, trying not to squirm. "I don't recall the exact number, but I would estimate several dozen." Jasmine opened a binder, thick with tabs. "We have documentation showing 117 contracts issued under your authority. 43 of those were with Patriot Foods, LLC. That sound familiar now?" He hesitated. "Yes." "And how many of those contracts were competitively bid?" He swallowed. "To my knowledge, none." A flicker of movement crossed Trump's face, the kind of wince you try to suppress when the structure you built starts to shake. Jasmine's voice remained cool. "And do you remember a private dinner at Mar-a-Lago on April 5, 2018? Guest list included yourself, Robert D. Haskins, and then-President Trump?" Acker stiffened. "I was invited, yes." 3 weeks after that dinner," Jasmine said, flipping pages, "Patriot Foods received its first emergency no-bid contract for $36 million. You signed the authorization." She turned the binder around and showed the committee his signature. Blue ink, unmistakable. "Was that a coincidence, Mr. Acker?" He shifted again. "That contract was within the bounds of emergency procurement law." Jasmine didn't let up. "What emergency? There was no food shortage, no supplier collapse, no threat to public safety, just a dinner, a donation, and a contract." He opened his mouth, closed it. She stepped closer. "You funneled public money into the hands of unqualified donors, children, and got sick. Some were hospitalized. And you call that within bounds?" From across the room, Representative Caldwell muttered, "This is insane." But Jasmine wasn't done. She walked to the whiteboard and began to chart the timeline. Red circles marked every contract. Green boxes highlighted donor dinners. Arrows connected dates to filings, procurement memos, and campaign contributions. The visual web was undeniable. "This," she said, turning back, "was not bureaucracy. It was a feeding frenzy." She clicked one final slide onto the projector, an internal memo titled High-Value Vendor Partnerships, Strategic Justification Draft, authored by Acker, dated just weeks after that Mar-a-Lago dinner. One line stood out. Priority should be placed on contractors whose ideological alignment ensures discretion and reliability. Jasmine let the room read it in silence. She turned to Acker one last time. "Was it discretion or silence you were paying for?" Acker looked down, his fingers clenched, and for the first time in the hearing, he didn't speak. The chair leaned forward, voice taut. "Mr. Acker, you are reminded you are under oath and subject to criminal referral." Jasmine walked back to her seat, the weight of evidence behind her like a tidal wave gaining momentum. Trump's jaw was tight, his team shaken. The committee was no longer divided, just stunned. The truth was out. The signatures were visible, and the checks, they had names now. The hearing had crossed a line, no longer speculation, no longer abstract ethics or political theater. Now, it was about patterns, visible, traceable, undeniable. Jasmine stood again, this time not with another child's photo or a redacted memo, but with data. Cold, damning data. Behind her, a screen displayed a simple pie chart. "These," she said, gesturing to the slices, "are all Trump-era emergency food contracts issued between 2018 and 2020. 76% of those contracts, $1.4 billion, had gone to vendors with no previous federal experience. Most had one thing in common: political donations. She tapped to the next slide. Patriot Foods, as we've discussed, received nearly $260 million. But they weren't alone. The names rolled down the screen like a slow drip of rot. Red Harvest Supply, Liberty Meal Group, AmeriCare Provisions. Each company had something missing from its background. No health compliance track record, no USDA partnership, no institutional training. But each had something else in abundance: political access. Jasmine's tone deepened. AmeriCare Provisions received $84 million in contracts after sponsoring a business leadership breakfast at the Trump International Hotel. They were also the subject of a suppressed FDA investigation in 2019 for mold contamination in protein bars sent to FEMA shelters. She paused. 13 veterans hospitalized in the aftermath. A ripple of gasps moved through the chamber. She tapped again. Red Harvest's CEO was on Trump's advisory committee for rural America. Their facilities had a listeria outbreak just 3 months before they received approval to supply juvenile detention centers. She turned to the committee. This isn't just incompetence. This is corruption, weaponized through logistics. This is food as a vehicle for profit, paid for by the most vulnerable. From the back of the room, one reporter typed furiously, eyes wide. Another muttered, "This is bigger than we thought." Jasmine didn't stop. She brought out a stack of rejected complaints, letters from detention facility staff, medical officers, and local inspectors. Each of these was filed to DHS. Each one was archived without investigation. Some were flagged as politically sensitive. She raised a report from a FEMA site in Arkansas, where a school lunch pilot program, also subcontracted through Patriot Foods, was quietly shut down after students fell ill. The USDA classified it as a logistics failure, but emails showed it was due to improper storage and expired stock. Why was Patriot Foods even supplying school lunches? A committee member asked, stunned. Because once they had a federal vendor ID, Jasmine replied, they had access to all emergency food platforms: ICE, FEMA, VA, even tribal communities. The realization hit the room in stages. Jasmine watched as each face shifted, from outrage to disbelief, to something more dangerous: conviction. She ended with a final slide, a full map of the United States, red dots marking every site linked to food safety complaints under these vendors. The country was bleeding from within. This wasn't a failed policy, she said, voice tightening. It was a systemic operation, one that treated oversight as a formality and human bodies as acceptable collateral. Trump exhaled sharply. His arms were still crossed, but the posture had changed. He looked smaller now. And Jasmine? She stood taller than ever, not just prosecuting a scandal, but unveiling a machine of greed wrapped in red, white, and blue. And it wasn't done unraveling yet. The committee room was still reeling when Jasmine calmly reached into her briefcase and pulled out a thin manila envelope. No label, no seal, just a corner frayed from use, and a single paperclip barely clinging to the top. This arrived at my office 2 weeks ago, she began, holding it up for all to see. No return address, no contact, no explanation, just one memo. She slowly unfolded the pages. This is a redacted internal communication between senior procurement officers at the Department of Homeland Security, dated March 2020. Subject line: Mar-a-Lago Referral Protocol. The words hung in the air like ash. She turned to the panel. This memo outlines an informal channel outside the bidding process for referring vendors who were pre-vetted by members of the Trump transition team or directly by White House liaisons. These vendors were to be given preferential fast-track clearance for emergency supply contracts. Another pause. They were also to be exempt from certain pre-approval inspections due to time-sensitive national interest. A Republican committee member leaned forward, trying to interrupt. Jasmine's eyes locked on his. You'll get your time, but not before the people hear what they were never meant to know. She resumed. The memo detailed how internal compliance officers had objected to the Patriot Foods contract, citing both financial instability and lack of operational history. Their recommendation: full investigation and contract denial. That recommendation, the memo showed, was overridden due to personal assurance from OSPP contact. "What's OSPP?" someone asked. Jasmine answered without flinching. "Office of the Senior Presidential Personnel." The room fell completely silent. This wasn't a procurement oversight. It was a deliberate override from the highest levels. She turned the next page. Another email, dated just 2 days before the first border meal shipment. Subject: Urgent Directive, Texas Border Sites. Content: ensure non-disclosure of any visual documentation of meal quality. Under no circumstances are vendors to be filmed during delivery. A murmur spread through the journalists in the back. Jasmine didn't need to add commentary. The document spoke volumes, but still she pressed on, turning each page slowly, letting the weight of the content sink in. A third communication, marked confidential, destroy after review, revealed internal friction. A staffer named Armand Lyle had raised repeated objections to Patriot's contract and logged 3 formal complaints. 2 weeks later, he was transferred. No explanation, no paper trail, just gone. Jasmine read aloud his final flagged note. Risk of foodborne outbreak high. Supply chain integrity unverifiable. This contract appears more political than logistical. She let the silence do the rest. Trump had begun to fidget now, eyes dark ting between his counsel and the memo on screen. For the first time since the hearing began, he seemed genuinely unsure of himself. A low voice from the Republican side finally broke the silence. "Where did you get this?" Jasmine turned her gaze toward him, unwavering. "You should be asking why no one else had it." She closed the folder. "There are people inside your government, inside the walls of these institutions, who tried to stop this, and they were silenced." Now she leaned in. "But here's the truth. You can't smother a leak in a rotten system. It'll always find a way through." The audience behind her broke into scattered applause. The chairman banged the gavel, but it was too late. The tone had shifted. Jasmine had pulled the curtain back. This wasn't a food scandal anymore. It was a blueprint for corruption, and someone had left the instructions lying around. Next, she would show them where those instructions led. Outside the hearing room, a single story had begun to circulate, quietly, but with growing momentum. It wasn't a policy debate or a contract dispute. It was about a child. And that morning, that child walked through the metal detectors of Capitol Hill with trembling hands and shoes too big for his feet. 12-year-old Miguel Hernandez, accompanied by his pro bono attorney and a child advocacy liaison, took a seat in the witness prep room. He wore a borrowed blazer and held a small plastic toy soldier in his hand, rubbing its feet against his thumb like a ritual. Jasmine had met him only once before, in a shelter in El Paso, surrounded by rows of bunk beds and forgotten paperwork. He hadn't spoken much, but he had drawn a picture, a food tray, some flies, and a crying face. That was months ago. Today, he had found his voice. The committee room filled to capacity when his name was called. Jasmine stood beside him as he took his seat at the front, his feet not yet touching the floor. "Do you promise to tell the truth?" the clerk asked. Miguel nodded, eyes wide. Jasmine leaned in gently. "Oh, you can speak in Spanish, okay? We have a translator here for you." He took a breath. "Sí." The translator's voice carried across the room as Miguel began. There were worms in the food. Sometimes the bread was green. Sometimes the meat smelled bad, like it was dead too long. The camera zoomed in, not for spectacle, but because no one could look away. Miguel's voice shook, but he didn't stop. "One time, my stomach hurt so much I thought I would die. They gave me water and told me to go to sleep. My friend Diego, he couldn't eat for 3 days. They put him in isolation because he vomited in the hallway." Gasps rippled through the room, not from activists or journalists, but from aides, staffers, and even a few lawmakers. Jasmine kept her expression steady, but her fingers were white from gripping the desk. Miguel reached into his blazer and pulled something out, a folded napkin, yellowed with time. Inside it was a small, petrified slice of bread, cracked, green speckled and hardened like stone. "I kept it," he said softly, "because I didn't think anyone would believe me." One senator rose to object, to question the validity, the theatrics. But the chairman cut him off. "Sit down, Senator. Let the boy finish." Jasmine placed her hand on the table gently. "Miguel, can you tell them where the food came from?" He hesitated, then nodded. "There was a truck. It said, 'Patriot Foods' on the side. The men wore red hats and sunglasses. They laughed when we cried about being hungry." It wasn't just testimony. It was indictment. From a child. From memory. From pain. Miguel's voice began to fade. He looked down at the toy soldier in his hand, and for a moment, his composure broke. "I thought America would be safe. My mama told me it would be safe." Jasmine's voice cracked when she leaned in. "I'm sorry, Miguel. You deserved better." The chairman cleared his throat, visibly shaken. "That's all for now. Thank you, young man." As Miguel was led out of the room, the silence was absolute. Even Trump, who had begun the day smug and stone-faced, now stared down at the table, unmoving. Jasmine stood. "I want that testimony entered into the permanent record." No one objected. In that moment, policy became personal. The scandal had a name, a face, a child with a toy soldier and a slice of poisoned bread. And America had just heard him speak. And the nation, whether it admitted it or not, was now on trial. The media storm following Miguel's testimony was immediate and ferocious. Cable networks looped clips of his trembling voice. Editorials ran headlines like, "The child who broke the silence." But Jasmine wasn't finished. What Miguel described wasn't just abuse. It was a pipeline, a transactional nightmare built on profit, politics, and silence. Back in her office, under dim lights and stacks of redacted files, she laid out the final pieces. A whistleblower from inside Patriot Foods had reached out. Anonymous, but careful. Over several weeks, Jasmine's team had quietly gathered routing slips, internal memos, and most damning of all, a digital export from the company's accounting software, encrypted, but not impenetrable. Her chief of staff decrypted it after a sleepless weekend. What it revealed was staggering. Over $27 million in expedited emergency supply contracts were routed through shell companies tied to Mar-a-Lago members. Some of them never delivered a single shipment. Others did, but the product was substandard, expired, and uninspected. Names attached to these invoices included former aides, distant relatives, and PAC donors who had magically transformed into logistics consultants. Jasmine printed every page. The next day, in the hearing room, she stood once more, this time without props, without theatrics, just paper and a microphone. On March 14, 2020, a company named American Libert Supply, LLC received $4.3 million from the Department of Homeland Security. They claimed to provide emergency food services to the El Paso detention facility. The address listed: a luxury condo in West Palm Beach, no warehouse, no deliveries, just a mailbox. The pages fell on the desk one by one, each slap louder than the last. Another vendor, Red Line Operations Group, $6.1 million, no business license, registered to a golf instructor at Mar-a-Lago. She turned to the panel. This wasn't just negligence, this was theft, from taxpayers, from children, from the very idea of public trust. And then she looked directly at Trump. "Sir, these companies were all awarded contracts during your administration, without competitive bidding. Many of them list personal connections to you, your resorts, or your political donors. Do you deny that?" Trump didn't blink. "I don't know anything about these contracts." Jasmine held up a document. "Then how do you explain your handwritten note in the margin of this March 2020 memo? Fast track this one. Patriot Foods is reliable. Signed, DJT." The room erupted. The chairman banged his gavel, but the press gallery had already surged to life. Trump tried to lean toward his lawyer, but Jasmine kept going. "This isn't partisan. This is criminal. And every child who got sick, every parent who never got answers, every taxpayer who trusted their government, deserves to know who profited while children starved." Behind her, the screens lit up. showing side-by-side photos of ICE detention centers, invoice scans, and smiling Mar-a-Lago members at fundraising galas. One by one, the faces connected. One by one, the silence deepened. This wasn't about bad policy anymore. This was embezzlement wearing the mask of patriotism, and Jasmine Crockett had just torn the mask off. By the next morning, every front page in America was a battlefield. Crooked cunt. Racts and moldy meals blared across cable news banners. Primetime anchors dissected Jasmine's documents line by line. Analysts cross-referenced the vendors, and digital sleuths began unmasking each. I believe the Justice Department has every tool it needs to restore faith in this government. The evidence is in their hands now. If they don't act, the people will remember that too. Outside her office, protesters had gathered, not against her, but because of her. Parents of detained children, veterans angry about moldy military rations, activists carrying photos of children like Miguel's sister, their faces framed in candles and signs. One sign read, "Who got paid while my daughter starved?" Even Trump's allies in Congress began quietly backing away. Statements shifted from denial to deflection. We weren't aware of these procurement details. If there were oversights, they should be corrected. Let the legal process play out. But it was too late. The Office of the Inspector General released an emergency bulletin. A joint investigation had been launched with the FBI and IRS into Patriot Foods and its subcontractors. Every vendor listed in Jasmine's report was now flagged. Jasmine stood at her window, watching the storm gather outside. She wasn't smiling. There was no victory in this, no celebration in proving a system was as broken as the children it left behind. Her phone buzzed, a message from Miguel's guardian. She smiled today. First time since El Paso. "Thank you." She blinked. The city blurred through tears she hadn't expected. Back in the hearing chamber, a special session was scheduled, this time without Trump's legal team stalling. Jasmine knew what came next wouldn't be easy. There would be legal pushback, political smears, and coordinated media attacks, but the silence had been broken, permanently. She gathered her notes, straightened her jacket, and stepped back into the hallway. The cameras were already waiting, and this time no one could look away. Behind the gilded doors and manicured hedges, the former president sat alone in the club's private COO's Tootie, watching yet another brutal montage on Fox News. Jasmine's voice echoed over a split screen showing expired rations and ICE detention centers. His own face, frozen in that damning 19-second silence, had become a meme, a symbol, a scar. Then came the voice that always irritated him. "They're saying Ivanka signed off on the supplemental contracts," said Jared, arms folded, lips tight. Trump turned slowly, his gaze cold and unblinking. "You told me those names wouldn't show up. They were buried 3 layers deep, shells under shells. We never expected." She found them in 1 week. Trump's voice was barely above a growl. 1 damn week. Don Jr. stepped in from the hallway, phone in hand. "We're getting hammered online, even Truth Social's turning on us." Trump shot him a glare. "Because none of you could keep it clean. This wasn't hard. Sell the food, hide the paper. Simple." Ivanka entered last, calm but tight-lipped. "We need to lawyer up. All of us." He laughed bitterly. "You think that's new? You think I haven't been lawyering up since 2015? "No," she said, crossing her arms. "But this time, it's not just politics. You fed kids maggot meat." The room went still. "You're supposed to defend me," Trump muttered. "We did," she replied. "And now you've made us all radioactive." There was a beat of silence. Then Trump stood, looming in the middle of the room, arms heavy at his sides. "Maybe it's time some of you fell on the sword," he said. "The country loves a redemption arc." Jared paled. "Are you serious?" Trump didn't blink. "I built this empire. I won't watch it crumble because my kids got sloppy." Ivanka's voice lowered to ice. "Or because you used starving children as leverage." No one spoke after that, not even him. The hearing room had become a crucible, hot with lights, tense with silence, packed with history. By now, every network had gone live. The clip of Trump's 19-second silence had already been replayed tens of millions of times, but Jasmine Crockett wasn't finished. Not yet. She adjusted the microphone, hands steady, voice like a